Okay. Welcome. Welcome, Vernacchio, to our special talk tonight, Raising Sexually Healthy Kids at Any Age. If any of you aren't familiar with Vernacchio, Al teaches at Friends Central School in Waynewood, Pennsylvania. He's the coordinator of gender, sexuality, and consent education, and is also a member of the upper school English department. In his work as a sexuality educator, Al teaches classes, organizes sexuality-themed programs and student assemblies, and provides parent education on sexuality topics, which we are humbled to get a little bit of tonight. A human sexuality educator and consultant for over 30 years, Al has lectured, published articles, and offered workshops throughout the country. His work has been featured in Teaching Good Sex, a November 2011 cover story in the New York Times Magazine. Al has given 4 TED Talks and has appeared on national programs such as NPR's Morning Edition, 1A, and Radio Times. He is author of the For Goodness of Sex, a sex-positive guide to raising healthy, empowered teens, which will be published in a revised and expanded edition by Harper Wave in 2023. So look out for that. Al earned his BA in theology from St. Joseph's University and his MED in human sexuality education from the University of Pennsylvania. He's a member of the Society for Scientific Study of Sexuality, the ASECT Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and Advanced Sexuality Educators and Trainers. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to Al. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. So happy to be here with you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am Al Vernacchio. I'm coming to you from my classroom tonight here at Friends Central School. And I'm delighted to be with you to be able to talk about how we can help the young people in our lives grow up and become sexually healthy citizens of the world. We live in a world, as you know, that can make it difficult for young people to grow up healthy in terms of sexuality. There's lots of messaging that they receive every day, telling them all kinds of things, some of which may be helpful for them, some of which may not be helpful for them. And we, the adults in their lives, the folks who care about them and love them, the more equipped we can be to speak to them honestly and openly in a forthright manner about their lives, about the world, the better they'll be. And what I want to do tonight is just offer you some practical guidelines for how to do that. And then I'm really interested in the questions that you're bringing tonight, because whatever your specific needs or wants are, I'd love to be able to help address those. At Friends Central, I am the sexuality educator for our entire school, and our school is nursery through 12th grade. So I am responsible for programming to help develop healthy sexuality from our youngest students who are 3 years old up through our oldest students who are 18 years old. So I'm very comfortable talking about that entire range of development. So no matter what age the young people are in your life, we can talk about it this evening. And I hope my comments will be applicable enough to that very wide age range. So let me start just by clarifying what I mean when I say sexuality, because I think the word sexuality is often misused and often misunderstood. One of the activities I do with my high school kids is I give them a blank index card and I ask them not to put their name or any identifying information on the card, but to just write down their own definition of the word sexuality. And then I collect those cards and I mix them up, and then I sort of read them all out loud. So we get a sense of, what people are thinking. And very often when you ask people about the word sexuality, they will often come back with one of two definitions. They'll either say that sexuality is about kind of sexual activity, sort of especially like the body parts that are between our legs and what we do with them. Or they will sometimes say that sexuality is about who we're attracted to, who we fall in love with, who we want to be sexual with. Those are both correct answers, but they're both incomplete answers. Sexuality encompasses much more than just a narrow part of our bodies and our attractions. So when I think about sexuality, I think about learning about our whole body, because our whole body is a sexual organ. There's no part of our body that's not connected to our sexuality. I think about our gender, and there's a lot about gender that you may have read and heard about these days. When I think about gender, I think about the mind, because what we know is that our gender identity, that little voice that tells us who we are in terms of gender, whether we feel like a boy or a girl or both or neither, that is deeply seated inside our brain. We don't understand the exact mechanisms of how that works, but we know that that is a process that goes on in our mind. And then we think about our heart and those attractions, who we are attracted to as we come into adolescence, who we are turned on by, who we think about in sexual ways. And then we think about our sexual choices and behaviors. What is it that we do with this body? What is it that we do with those attractions? What do we do with our sense of self? How do we show that to the outside world? Does it feel safe to show that to the outside world? And lastly, aside from all those things that are kind of within us, there's also a huge force outside of us. Every day we walk through a world that is bombarding us with messages about our bodies, about our gender, about our desires, about sexual activity, and we need to learn how to navigate those. So healthy sexuality is helping young people of any age and stage be able to think age appropriately about their body, about their gender, about their developing sense of ability to love people and to be attracted to people, about choices they make, and about navigating those messages that they get as soon as they walk outside of our home. They also get them at home, of course. So that's what I mean by sexuality. It's a big, broad concept. And I think sometimes adults get nervous about talking about sexuality with young people because they're afraid that they have to talk about genitals or they have to talk about sexual activity or things like that. And there's a whole range of things we can be talking about. And yes, we do need to talk about body parts and sexual activity in age-appropriate ways. And I'll talk about that in a second. I want to give you four, what I call guiding principles, four big ideas that I think can be very helpful when we're trying to engage with young people about healthy sexuality. And then I'll get into some specific topics and how to address those. So the first of my four big ideas, and this is really key to my work, it's the foundation for my work, it's that I think we have to really believe that our sexuality is a force for good in the world. You know, many of us grew up learning, unfortunately, that sexuality is dirty or is dangerous or is some kind of wild force that needs to be controlled. That's not true. Our sexuality is the thing that allows us to most authentically figure out who we are, to really know ourselves most truly. Because what is more true than our body, our mind, and our heart working in combination to help us make choices in the world? Our sexuality allows us to create relationships that are based in authenticity. Once we know who we are, we can bring that authentic self to relationships, whether they're friendships or sweetheart relationships, or relationships with mentors or relationships with teachers or whatever. And then those authentic relationships will help the world improve and be better. So literally, healthy sexuality makes the world better. But unless we're starting from a place with young people where we're really conceiving of our sexuality as this positive force, not this thing to be afraid of, then it's very hard to help them develop positive messages, because then we work out of fear. And my second big point for you, my second guiding principle, is that when we're talking to young people about sexuality, it's really important that we lead with our hopes and not with our fears. Again, a lot of us, and I am the first to acknowledge that the world is not always a very safe or healthy place for our young people. I acknowledge that, and we have to think about that. But if we spend all our time working from that point, what our young people are going to hear is a whole series of no, don't, danger, beware. Those messages have their place, but they're not the messages that help people grow in confidence, excuse me, in confidence about themselves. So think about this. No matter what kid or children or kids you're thinking about, and maybe you're thinking about an adolescent, or maybe you're thinking about a young person, try to imagine what you hope that young person will become. I think most of us, when we think about young people in our lives, our best hopes for them are that they are people who are confident, who understand their bodies, who feel good about their bodies, who feel secure in their identity, who feel at peace with their desires, who make decisions about sexuality deliberately and purposefully and based on values they have, and who are creating relationships that are healthy and joyous and fun and wonderful. Start there and ask yourself, what's a message that's going to help my young person take a step towards that? Because when we orient ourselves to sexuality from a hopeful place, not a fearful place, we're much more likely to give messages to kids that help them figure out all the yeses rather than simply listing a pile of no's. One of the things I always suggest is that no matter what age kid we're talking about, if I'm going to give a kid a no, I want to also give a kid a yes. So if I'm going to say to a teenager, I don't think you're ready for genital sexual contact with another person. And I'll tell you that I teach ninth graders, and I say to ninth graders all the time, based on my experience as a sexuality educator, I don't think you're ready to be messing with somebody else's genitals. But here's what I think. Ninth grade is a great year to really practice your kissing game, to really become really good at kissing. I don't think kissing is a gateway drug. I don't think kissing leads to other things necessarily. Kissing is an intimate act. And by the way, I think hopefully we all know this, right? A good kisser is really valuable. Like, they're worth their weight in gold. We've had plenty of bad kisses in our lives, I imagine. I certainly have. So to say to a ninth grader, no, I don't think genital activity is really what should be on the table for you. But I do think that, being with somebody, hugging them, kissing them, kind of making out, maybe that's actually an okay thing for you to be exploring at this point in your life. Now, again, that's going to depend on our personal values. That might depend on different religious orientations that we bring to it. All of that we have to consider. But I'm just saying, I'm just using that as an example of leading from hope and not from fear, right? Because if a ninth grader is focusing on kissing, and if they're saying, yeah, genital sexual activity, probably not really something I feel ready for, then that really helps us, that relieves us of some of the things we are worried about, like unplanned or unwanted pregnancies, like emotional labor that people aren't really ready for in terms of their emotional development. So things like that. So sexuality is a force for good is number one. Work from your hopes, not your fears, is number two. My third big guideline for you is and this is not mine, this comes from another sexuality educator named Debbie Rothman, who's awesome. Debbie always says, it's better to have 100 one-minute talks with a kid than to have one 100-minute talk. And I totally believe that. I think it is never too soon for us to start talking to kids in our lives about healthy sexuality, because we can do that in age-appropriate ways at every age and stage. But I think we have to get rid of the idea that these conversations need to be heavy, serious, sit down at the table, put on our stern face, have this kind of somber moment. These conversations should be natural. They should be spontaneous. They should be tied to whatever is happening in our lives and in our kids' lives. So here's an example of some 1-minute conversations with kids. For little kids, let's say kids who might be in kindergarten or first or second grade, right? A 1-minute sex talk might be something as simple as, you get to be in charge of your body. And it's really important that that people don't, give you hugs unless you say you want a hug. Right? Or another 1-minute talk might be something like, oh, that song you're singing all the time. Let's look at what that song is saying about, about girls or about boys or about being a cool person. Hey, that cartoon you watch, did you notice that there's all different kinds of families in that cartoon? There are some families that have a mom and a dad. There are some families that have 2 moms. There are some families that have 1 parent. Isn't that interesting that families can come in so many different forms? Those are all, quote unquote, sex talks. And they're all very developmentally appropriate. When we're getting into middle school, having conversations with kids about the music they're listening to, not in a like you kids and your music way, but in a, hey, have you thought about that song? Do you hear what it's saying? And are you okay with that? Asking it as a question, not as that's a terrible song to listen to necessarily. Or perhaps with the video games they play. Hey, do you notice that in the video game you're playing, all of the female characters are, the weakest characters in the game? What do you think about that? That's a sex talk. Or, again, something like, hey, with my 4th and 5th graders at school, we talk about crushes. And we talk about, hey, it's really normal to have crushes or not. Some people have them, some people don't. And what do you do with a crush when you have it? Well, you can do nothing. You can talk to the person you have a crush on. You can tell a trusted adult. I always say to 4th and 5th graders, I don't think it's fair if you have a crush on somebody and you tell all your other friends, but you don't talk to the person you have a crush on. Like, that doesn't seem fair to me, right? So that's a sex talk. With teenagers, again, everything from, are we thinking about birth control? How are you making decisions about being sexually active? How are you thinking about the combination of drugs and or alcohol and sexual activity? Those are really powerful conversations. And again, they can be in the car, they can be around the dinner table, they can be as you're dropping them off for soccer practice, they can be anywhere. Little talks that happen consistently. And it doesn't even have to be verbal, right? Like, I love parents, many of you may do this already. You put notes in your kids' lunch if you send your kids to school with a lunchbox, right? Why not make those lunch messages about healthy sexuality? Why not have a note in a lunchbox that says, I hope you'll make good choices today? Or a note that says, I hope you know how beautiful you are. Or a note that says, your body is perfect just the way it is. Or a note that says, I know that it can be difficult to feel really turned on all the time, but I believe that you are somebody who can make good choices around that. Or even something like, hey, if you feel yourself too turned on, remember, say your multiplication tables. That's a great way to sort of break that thought cycle. Little tiny things, 100 1-minute talks rather than 100-minute talk. And my last of the big principles, and then I'll talk about some specifics, is to use what I call a nourishment model rather than a disaster model when we talk about sexuality. So here's what I mean by that. I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. And in the 80s, when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was just beginning, people were terrified. And, appropriately so. It was a really scary time. And what happened in sex ed was a lot of sex ed started to become very much disaster focused. There's a really famous sex ed film from the 80s that's called No Second Chances. That's really the name. So already you can get a sense of what it's going to be. And there's a scene where a nurse is talking to a group of high school kids. Perfectly appropriate. I love nurses. They can be great sexuality educators. This nurse, not so much. So she's in this class, and a high school boy raises his hand, and he asks a very typical high school kid question. What if I don't want to wait until I'm married to have sex? That's a real honest question that a kid can ask. And in the film, this nurse looks at him, and she doesn't miss a beat, and she says, well, I guess you'll just have to be prepared to die. And then she says, and you'll probably take your spouse and your children with you. And this kid's like, whoa, like, first of all, I'm 15. I don't have a spouse and kids. And you're telling me if I have sex, I'm going to die? Like, how do you develop healthy sexuality with a message like that? That's the disaster model. And many of us may have been raised with that with that orientation of education. And that just leads us to be fearful and paranoid and anxious. And it doesn't allow us to really explore and think about and embrace sexuality. So when I say a nourishment model, here's what I mean. If you think about us as human beings, we are organic human beings. We are living beings. And one of the things we know about living beings is that our bodies have developed all these amazing systems to help us stay healthy and regulated. Like, for example, we need fuel, we need food and water to survive and to be healthy. And our body has mechanisms to tell us when we're hungry. We feel hungry or we feel thirsty. And in those moments, that's our body saying, hey, we're lacking some really important nourishment that we need to be healthy. So let's get on that, right? Now, when that happens, when we feel hungry, one of the things we also recognize is we can make choices about what to do about that, right? We can not only decide, yes, it's time to eat, but we can decide, what are we going to eat? And sometimes we choose junk food, and sometimes we choose healthy food, and sometimes we eat too much, and sometimes we eat not enough. There's all kinds of choices in that thing. But basically, we're just responding to a need for nourishment. Our bodies are able to tell us when we're hungry for something. Let's think about sexuality in that same way. When we're experiencing some kind of sexual desire or sexual hunger, our body is telling us we need something. We're hungry for something. The trick is to help kids think about, what are you hungry for? This is probably more appropriate for the older kids than for the younger kids. But for example, I spend a lot of time talking to teenagers about, like sometimes when you really are feeling those urges, what you're really hungry for is touch. Well, there's a million kinds of touch you can have, not just sexual touch. Or maybe you're hungry for intimacy, for closeness to somebody. I always tell my high school kids, it's far more intimate to take a nap with somebody than to have sex with them. Like, if you really want to be vulnerable with somebody, you really want to be in a trusting position with somebody, fall asleep with them. That's a lot of trust and intimacy. Often, it can be more intimacy than is involved in a sexual encounter. And maybe that might feed our hunger in ways that are more satisfying. Because I also met high school kids who tell me, yeah, I had sex, but it didn't feel like I thought it was going to feel. And it didn't do, I thought it was going to make everything better, and it didn't. I thought I was going to feel good about myself, and I don't. And other kids, of course, have the opposite reaction. It does. But I think helping kids think about, what are we hungry for? Is it intimacy? Is it touch? Is it connection? Is it communication? Is it an orgasm? Is it body pleasure? What is it? And differentiating those hungers helps us make choices about what's the most appropriate way to feed those hungers. Because a diet that is only serves one kind of food, we know is not the healthy diet. So if sex is the answer to everything, we have a really poor diet. And I think I've had really great success engaging with kids around conversations like that. They get it. And I think that's helpful. So those are my 4 big points for you. Sexuality is a force for good. Lead with your hopes and not with your fears. Have 100 one-minute talks rather than 100-minute talk. And try to use a nourishment model, thinking about our sexual needs and desires as hungers that deserve to be fed, and that when they are well fed, we are healthy. Okay? So those are my big ideas. Now I'm going to just talk about a few specifics, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm checking our time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you all to be able to put questions. And again, if you have questions as I'm speaking, do feel free to put them in the chat. If you think you won't be able to remember it, I'm happy to break at any point and address something. If something is unclear, if you want a follow-up question about something, please feel free. I'm here for you tonight, and I'm here to help you get the information that you most want and need to feel like you can leave here with some very practical ideas to help have conversations with young people about healthy sexuality, whatever age they are. All right, let me say a quick word about language. Very often when we think about talking to young people about sexuality, one of the things we have to think about is like, what language are we going to use? And how comfortable are we with language? So, we might actually need to do some practicing beforehand. And I always say, if you're nervous about having a conversation with a kid, have that same conversation with your best friend first. Practice it with them. Or practice it with your sweetheart. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I want to try something out on you and see how it sounds. Or, if you have older kids in your life, say, hey, I'm thinking about talking to your little brother or sister, and I want to try this out. So it's okay to practice the language. The more challenged we feel around language, the harder it's going to be. I'll tell you 2 really quick, totally true stories. When I was 13, my mom sat me down. I was raised in an Italian-American Roman Catholic family in South Philadelphia, very traditional. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I'm the first person in my family to go to college and to become a teacher. My dad was a carpenter. My mom was a homemaker. They were salt of the earth, really good people. And they tried, they wanted so much to have kids. They actually were married for 15 years before they had their first kid. I don't know what they were doing for the first 15 years, but anyway, they finally figured out, and I came along, and there was joy. So when my mom wanted to sit me down and talk to me about sex, she sat me down and said, I want to talk to you today about the Marriage Act. She said, now the Marriage Act is it's a very beautiful thing. It's something that you should feel comfortable talking to me about and that you should respect. But it's for married people. That's why it's called the Marriage Act. It's not something for people who aren't married. And I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell are you talking about? I have no idea what this Marriage Act is. So then she said, do you have any questions? And I was like, no. And it was like years later, I was like, oh, she was talking about sex. Now, what my mom was trying to do, and I give her a lot of credit for this, is she was not only trying to give me information, she was trying to put it in a value framework, which is great. But she was using language that I just didn't understand because she was so uncomfortable she couldn't say sex or intercourse to me. Those are words I understood. So don't lose the chance at having a good conversation with a young person because you're stumbling over words. So sort of like practice your words, and then go for it. When you're talking, try to be as inclusive as you can. One of the things you've heard me say several times is the word sweetheart. I never say to kids, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? I always say, do you have a sweetheart, or when you have a sweetheart? Because that's an inclusive word that isn't necessarily gendered, that doesn't necessarily imply a certain ethnicity or religion or any of that stuff. And obviously, it's okay if our values are that people should have sweethearts within a certain cultural or religious context. If that's your value, that's okay. But I try to use words that are very inclusive so that a kid, when they're hearing me, feels like I can be talking to them. As somebody who grew up, and was constantly asked if I had any girlfriends, and I had, growing awareness that girlfriends weren't going to be it for me, that language was not helpful. That just kind of like told me those adults were not safe people to talk to. They were not people who really saw me. So the more inclusive we can be, the better a chance we have at making a real connection. Okay, second big topic, bodies. We all have a body. We live in a society that is very hard on our bodies. Our kids get messages every day that tell them that their body is not thin enough, muscular enough, sexual enough, beautiful enough. Those messages are very powerful, and we need to help them navigate them. So whether your kid is 5 or 15, here are some quick things about bodies that can be helpful to say. The first is, it's normal that everybody has a different body. There is no one perfect body. There is no one ideal body. The media tries to tell us there is. That's a lie. Everybody's body is different, and every different body has different sort of ranges, right? I also tell people, and I think this is important, your body has kind of a base model, right? Human beings actually usually come in 3 base models. It's kind of like cars. Cars come in like compacts and sedans and SUVs. So human bodies are like that. There are bodies that are kind of very naturally thin. Those are bodies, those people who can eat forever and never gain a pound. And those people who, they work out and they get a lot of definition, but they never get bulk. Those people are called ectomorphs. It just means they have a naturally thin body and a really high metabolism. Then there's people in the middle. Those are called mesomorphs. That body type is like a sedan. Those are bodies that can sort of put on or take off weight pretty much equally well. They're bodies that if they work out a lot, they can get both definition and sort of bulk up a little bit. Those are sort of the mid-range bodies. And then there are bodies that are called endomorphs. Hi, that's me. We are naturally round, fleshy people. And I have been round and fleshy from birth. And that is not because I am unhealthy. And that is not because I am lazy. And that is not because of some fault of me. That's because that's the base model body I got. And when I was a little kid, people told me, if you exercise, you can have whatever body you want. That's a lie. Because I exercised a lot as a little kid, and I turned out to be a more fit, roundish person. And I thought, well, screw that. That doesn't work. And then I basically sat on my butt for the next 20 years and neglected a lot of my health until I got smart enough to say, wait a minute. I actually can't change, my desire to be 6'2" and skinny and tall, that's never going to happen for me. That's an unrealistic expectation. I can be a really fit, healthy, round, fleshy person. That's a really good goal for me to pursue. And so with kids, helping them realize that, our bodies do bend and flex, but only to certain degrees. And that we have certain body types, and we have to learn to love those body types. Now, for kids who are transgender, I don't want to convey a message that says you're stuck in the body you're in. Because we know that for kids who are trans, for kids who are gender nonconforming, for kids who are transitioning, that of course it's possible to modify bodies, and that we can do that very successfully. But, again, if I'm transitioning, if I were transgender and I were going to transition to become a woman, I'm still going to be a round, fleshy woman. I'm not going to suddenly become a woman who's 110 pounds and 6'2". So again, how do we help kids understand what's possible with bodies and what's not? What's realistic to think about, what's not? And to stop to sort of push back against those messages that say you're going to have any body you want. You can be you can be perfect. The last thing I want to say about bodies, and again, this is true for every age, is an important message is you need to be an expert on your body. You need to know your body better than anybody else, which means you have to know what your body looks like, what your body feels like. You have to know what's normal for your body and what your body likes. When it comes to younger kids, that means things like trusting them when they say, I have a bellyache or I don't feel good. That means helping kids say, no, I can say no to a hug or a touch I don't want because my body doesn't want that. With older kids, that means like, I say to teenagers all the time, how would you expect somebody to interact with your genitals if you don't know anything about them? If you don't love them yourself, how are you going to help other people love it or love those parts of your body? If you don't feel well equipped and like an expert on your body and how it works, then how do you invite somebody in to share that body with you and feel confident? And those are conversations we can have, and those can be really helpful and powerful. So some things about bodies. Checking our time, we're doing great. I want to say a quick word about identity and pronouns. This is a big topic today, and this is one that I have to say, so I'm 58 years old. If you are anywhere near my generation, this feels really different than when we were growing up. So when we grew up, it was expected that growing up meant you kind of like figured out who you were and bing, bang, boom, there you were. Today, young people grow up with the idea that identity is fluid and flexible. And they are much more comfortable than I think our generation ever was at saying, I'm going to try this label, see how that feels. That doesn't work, I'll try this one. Like, we have fourth graders in my school who, and fourth grade's a perfectly developmentally appropriate time for this to happen. They're like, I think I want to try a different pronoun. And here's what can happen. We can all totally freak out and say, oh my God, what's happening? What's this about? Or we can say to a kid, okay, let's see how it goes. And we had a couple of fourth graders who were trying out they, them pronouns. Well, it turns out for one of those kids, that really spoke truth. And being able to being allowed to say, I want to be called they, them instead of he or she, really helped them feel much more authentic. For several of the other kids, they were like, yeah, that didn't work. I tried it, but it didn't work. And I think one of the things we'll find with kids is that as long as we're saying to them, what's most important is you find your authentic self, then it's kind of natural to say, well, I'm not sure who that is. And so I might some of the labels might switch. So that I understand how hard that can be. I really do. And I just ask you to be as calm and as patient, and as open-minded as you can be, right? None of us are perfect. None of us get this right all the time. But the most important thing is not to freak out. If your kid comes to you and says, I think I'm bisexual, whenever a kid tells me something about a label, I say, oh, it's great that you've discovered that. And then if I'm not sure what that means, I say, well, tell me about that. Tell me what that means for you. And then here's what I say. I say, you know what? If that label is speaking truth to you now, I'm happy that you found it. Just so you know, if that label just gets more and more true, great. But if that label doesn't really seem to continue to fit, I'm okay with that. If that label changes, I can handle that. Like, I want you to be who you are most authentically. And I don't know who that is. I may have some ideas about who I want you to be, but I'm not really in charge of that. You really are. And so my job's to listen and to support you and to help you, and to help you know you don't need to lock yourself in. You know, at 13, at 14, at 15, I was thinking I had to figure out who I was and make some very declarative statements. And, you know, I actually didn't, because I had a lot of growing still to do. And so if we can say to kids, yeah, you're in a process. So I always say to adults, don't freak out at any one announcement. Look for the patterns. A pattern that continues is something to pay attention to, because maybe that's really revealing a truth. But something that's like, I'm going to try this, I might try that, that's okay. That's experimentation. That's developmentally appropriate. The more calm we can be about it, the less fraught kids will feel about that. All right, I'm going to say two more quick things, and then I'm going to open it up. Sorry, three more quick things, then I'm going to open up for questions. So I want to talk especially to you folks who have teenagers for a second. And I want to talk about the idea of sexual activity. And again, I appreciate that this can be an uncomfortable topic for folks. I think we have to really consider how we talk to young people about sexual activity. And here's what I mean. Our society is very focused on behaviors when it comes to sexual activity. Like, we're always interested in like what people are doing. What are the mechanisms? What are, you know, what body parts are going to what body parts and who's touching what? I don't think that's where we should focus. When I talk to kids about sexual activity, I would much rather focus on conditions rather than behaviors. So for example, if you define sex as like penis going into vagina, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that definition. But look at everything that's missing from that definition. A definition of sex that says sex is penis and vagina doesn't say anything about consent, doesn't say anything about pleasure, doesn't say anything about connection, doesn't say anything about whether the people are sober or not. So when I talk to teenagers about sexual activity, I say sex is consensual, sober, mutually pleasurable sexual activity that brings people closer. Now, there's a lot of activities that can fulfill those conditions, but those conditions for me are essential. If it's not consensual, it's not sex, it's violence. Why are we okay with sexual activity that's not mutually pleasurable? This may not be where you want to go with young people, but I'm just going to tell you this because I think it's an important thing to know. In terms of heterosexual sex, you know, penis and vagina sex, we have known since the 1970s that some huge percent of women do not regularly have orgasms through that sexual activity. So why do we keep insisting that that is the be-all and end-all of sexual activity? Yes, it is the way that you can have a baby if you want to get pregnant, absolutely. And it has a great importance for that. But if one of the things we're interested in is mutual pleasure, maybe that's not the best thing to do. And that can be a real, you know, our kids are interested in equity and equality. And I always say, you know, pleasure should be equal. It's not okay if you're in a sexual situation and one person's getting way more pleasure than somebody else. That's not fair. That's not equal. That's not just. That's not helping us connect. So again, conditions rather than behaviors. In terms of sober, we have a problem in this country where we conflate sex and alcohol. And I've met so many young people whose first sexual experience was under the influence of some kind of drugs or alcohol. And we're not going to make good decisions that way. And so being able to say to young people, look, what's this? Why is this? Why do we as a society keep linking these two things. Like, maybe that's not a great idea. And let's talk about it. And let's think about why maybe it's better to be sober when these things are going to happen. Again, those are brave conversations to have, but I think we can have them. I think sex is a social justice issue. I think sexual activity is something that yes, it can be fun. Yes, it can be just for the sake of itself, especially when we are adults and can make those decisions. But I think ideally, again, what we're looking for when we have that hunger is connection. And I think that a lot of sexual activity is devoid of connection. And I think we have to ask the question, like, what's that about? Because very often that means we're using another person as an object. We're not really seeing another person as a full human being. Okay. Consent. We're doing great. Consent. I do a lot of work around consent. This is the conversation we can have with little kids in grammar school all the way up to high school. When we think about consent, we often think about sexual consent. Let me tell you, when I talk to teenagers about sexual consent, they're like, that is so awkward. I can't talk about that. That feels so weird. It feels weird because they don't have any practice in thinking about consent in other situations. So I teach kids from when they're very little kids that consent has to happen whenever we interact with somebody else's body, property, or reputation. So if I'm going to interact with somebody else's body, I should have consent to do that. Whether that's, can I give you a hug? Can I put my arm around you? Or can I have sex with you? If I'm going to interact with somebody else's property, I don't pick up somebody else's toys without asking first. I don't pick up somebody else's cell phone without asking. I don't rummage through somebody's backpack without asking. And reputation. And this is really important for our social media kids. When I hear something about somebody else, before I just pass that on, I should think about, is it okay for me to pass this on? Does that person know this is being said about them? And are they okay with it? So in the ideal world, I want to check that out first before I hit that share button on my phone. And guess what? If I can get kids to practice what I call everyday consent in everyday non-sexual situations, by the time they get to sexual consent, it feels much more natural, much more normal, much more practiced, and much less weird. And so I think we really have missed the boat on consent a lot when we only focus on consent around sexual activity. We need to focus there. It's really important, but we need to link it to consent. We should be practicing consent all day in all kinds of situations. Think about how many times during a day you interact with somebody else's body, property, or reputation. Lots. And think about how often we actually are sure we have consent. Consent can be verbal or nonverbal. I always say the more serious the matter, the more I prefer verbal consent. A high five, when I put up my hand and you high five me, that's a nonverbal consent situation. I don't need to ask you, would you like to high five? Right? But if I'm going to have sex with you, I really want to hear words. I don't just want to have to interpret your eye movements or your smile or your body position. It's safer if I have words there. So those are kind of conversations we can have about consent. And the last thing about consent, power disrupts consent. And one of the things that kids can talk about, and little kids are very good at talking about this, is fairness. And it's not fair when somebody has a lot more power than somebody else. And if somebody has a lot more power, it makes it really hard for another person to honestly say yes or no, because they're so worried about that power dynamic. In high school, I talk to kids about what gives somebody power, you know, a later curfew, a driver's license, social capital, more money, parents who are easygoing. Think about how that power manifests in our relationships, in our interactions. The more we can identify power, the more we can think about how it interplays with consent. And for little kids, you know, one of the things that's a lesson is, yeah, actually, there are people that have more power than you. Grown-ups have more power than you. And it can be really scary when a grown-up asks you to do something that you really feel uncomfortable with. But you're still allowed to say no, even though that person has more power, right? Although as a teacher, you know, ideally, yes, as a teacher, I have more power than you do as a student. Hopefully, I'm not going to abuse my power. Hopefully, I'm going to use my power to help you. But yeah, you can still say no to me, even though I have more power. So those are conversations we can have. Last point before we go to questions, I want to talk about pornography, because that is such a huge issue today. You know, as soon as our kids get access to smartphones and computers, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when they're going to confront this material. Let me just say a couple of quick things about that. First of all, I think it's really important to make a distinction between pornography and what I call sexually explicit material. So pornography is material that is designed to sexually excite you. It's designed to be kind of, there's a word that's purulent. It's a word that means it's designed to be scintillating, to be titillating, to be kind of salacious. It doesn't really have any other purpose than to try to turn you on. Okay? And there's a lot of stuff out there that fits that definition. But a kid who's looking up how to use a condom and comes across a video of somebody putting a condom maybe actually on a real penis, I'm not sure that's pornographic. A kid's not going there to get turned on. A kid's going there to find information that's actually really helpful. Kids who are really interested in bodies and what bodies look like, it's very natural to have body curiosity. So how do we help them find information that's appropriate to help them discover the information they're looking for without having to resort to online pornography? Because often kids who use pornography to try to learn or to try to get information obviously get very skewed information. So the desire for information is not bad, it's developmentally appropriate. And we need to have resources, we need to have websites and books and materials that we can say to our 5-year-old, our 8-year-old, our 10-year-old, our 17-year-old, yeah, I know you're curious. Here are some things you can look to try to satisfy that curiosity, rather than looking to online porn. Secondly, I think we have to help kids understand that in many cases, I'm not somebody who says all or never very often. I think you may have noticed that. A whole lot of online mainstream porn is very dehumanizing. It treats people as objects. And whenever we treat people as objects, that's not okay. That's not fair. That's not just. That's not respectful. That's not loving. And so I really want us to be able to help kids think about that, you know? Help kids think about, when do we use people as objects? And why is that not okay? And a lot of online pornography does that. And lastly, a lot of kids think that watching porn is going to help them figure out like how to be sexual people. And, you know, that's like thinking you can learn how to drive by watching the Fast and the Furious movies. I mean, it's so funny. Every kid knows that the big blockbuster movies they go see are fantasy. They don't necessarily know that about pornography. But pornography is a constructed fantasy in the same way that a Marvel movie is, in the same way that a big Hollywood blockbuster is. It's a staged performance. It's not meant to be real. And so if you're thinking, oh, this is real, and I can learn about real from this, you're not going to learn that. So that's a really interesting message we can sort of give and convey, right? So those are just some things. And also the last thing, of course, like, you can't really learn about being sexual with another person by watching it. Like, that's a real life experience. We live in the real world. I mean, someday, yes, we're going to be totally avatars on some screen somewhere, and we're never going to have to actually touch another human being again. But that day's not here yet, and that's not going to be healthy for us. For most of us, one of the things we want is to really be able to lovingly touch another human being in ways that are pleasurable and that make us feel connection and that make us feel whole. That's not something you can learn by watching. So we really need to be able to convey those messages to kids. Okay, I'm at 7 o'clock. We go to 7:15. I want to save the last 15 minutes solely for questions. I see a couple of comments in the chat that I appreciate. I'm glad some of you think this is helpful. Kim, did you get questions to you that?
I did not. I think everyone's waiting until the end. So.
Okay. So folks, I would invite you either to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have, or feel free to drop them in the chat. Or again, if you want to do it privately, you can send a private chat just to Kim, and she will ask the question without identifying you. So let's just see if anything's out there. Hi, Zoe, go ahead. I see you.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you. I don't know if you.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
So thank you for all of this. This is very helpful. So there is something that I find myself always wondering how to tackle in the best way I can. My son spends a lot, he's 14. He spends a lot of time in his room with the door closed. We never go in, we always knock and wait for him to say, okay, come on, whatever. But sometimes I just wonder, he watches, like sometimes he has a screen in the room, and sometimes he's watching things. And of course, he's looking at his cell phone all the time. He interacts a lot with his friends. So I know he passes a lot of time like chatting and texting and sending selfies. However, I'm not sure how to tackle this about, hey, what are you watching? Or, without being very intrusive. I don't know.
Great question, Zoe. First of all, I love the fact that you, as a 14-year-old, you're giving him some ability, you're giving him a little space, you're knocking on the door. I love that. I think he's learning that you respect him and that you trust him, and that's good. I think maybe the way that I would approach this is to say to him, look, that we give you a lot of trust. We don't come barging into your room. We always knock before we do that. And I know that you are on your phone a lot, that you're chatting to your friends a lot, that you're on the screen a lot. And, I can't help but wonder, is everything you're looking at okay? And I just want you to know that if you ever see anything that you don't understand or that makes you feel uncomfortable, or if your friends are saying something that you don't just feel totally okay about, you can come and talk to me. You can come and ask me. And because I want to be helpful, I don't want to police everything you do, but I understand that there's a lot out there, and that at 14, you're going to see stuff that's going to be either confusing or surprising or interesting, and your friends can't answer all those questions for you. So I want to normalize for him the fact that, first of all, he is going to see things that are beyond his age. That's going to happen. And that you're a person, because you love him and because you respect him, you're a person he can come to for that. It doesn't guarantee he will, but it makes a nice invitation, and he's much more likely to do it when he really needs it than if you said, what are you looking at? I want to see what you're looking at. I want to look at your phone. Now, he's 14, you're a grown-up. You are allowed, if you want to say, you know what? You spend a lot of time in your room with the door closed. How about this? You get 2 hours a night to have your door closed. Otherwise, I think your bedroom door should be open. You can be in there. I'm not going to come in, but I'm not comfortable with you being in your room for 5 hours with the door closed. So let's say I'll give you 2 hours to have the door closed. And then otherwise, let's keep it open. How about that?
Right.
That's another thing to try, you know? Okay, is that helpful? Good.
Yeah, very helpful.
Good. Good. I see a couple things in the chat I want to see if I can address. Oh, when your teen is dating someone whose parents are not as open. Great. Okay. So very common. So I think this is really a parent-to-parent issue. This isn't so much a kid issue. Here's what I think, though. A couple things. One is, if you feel comfortable, if you can, I think saying to those parents something like, hey, I went to this lecture the other night with this guy talking about healthy sexuality. It was really cool. Do you want the link? Maybe you'd like to watch that. Or, hey, I know this guy who did this TED Talk about young people and sex. I thought it was interesting. That's one thing you can try. They may bite, they may not. Another thing is, I think, to talk to your kid and to say, look, so-and-so's, so-and-so, that your sweetheart might not be able to talk to their parents in the way that we talk. That maybe their parents feel a little differently about things. So you should know that if your sweetheart is feeling like they need to talk to somebody and they don't have adults in their life they can, you don't have to say they can come talk to me, because that might be more than you want to do. But you could say, maybe we can help them think about other adults in their life who might be helpful. Ultimately, it's not your job to change other parents' values. It's not your job to change their minds. And in some cases, I have to be honest about this. In some cases, you might have to say, you know what, kid who I love, I'm not sure this is a great relationship for you, because we're really talking about, you and your sweetheart are getting, like, we're speaking two different languages to you, and I wonder if that's confusing. I wonder if that's hard for you to sort of figure out, your boundaries or your roles or things like that. That's a really hard question, and one that I think is not one that I often get. I really appreciate it. I want to think more about it, but I do really think that if you want to sort of make an invitation or ovation to these other parents to sort of let them know that it's okay to it's okay to engage in these kind of conversations. Maybe they just never heard that before. Maybe that might be helpful. I want to attend to other things that are in the chat. So
we have one more in the chat.
Okay, go ahead. Maybe.
I work as a social worker in a high school. There are many girls that feel pressure to sexting boys. I see that as well in our high school. I had workshops and I noticed and spoke to boys that to them it's expected and normal to them to ask and receive them. How to approach talking to boys and girls about sexting.
Great, thank you for that question. So important. Yeah, sexting is so common and so fraught. So a couple things. One is that there's a whole lot of work we have to do with boys, because this whole thing that boys can feel entitled and expected to just like say, yes, I want you to send me a naked picture. I mean, there's a whole lot of like bravado involved in that. And I don't think boys have any idea what that actually can cost a young woman, or a young man for that matter. It can go both ways. So when we're talking to boys, I think we need to really be confronting with them this sort of entitlement that they feel around this. Like, what makes you think that's normal? What makes you think that's okay? The answer, by the way, is going to be porn, or one of the answers is going to be porn. Also, I will say that young people, all young people today, have a very different sense of privacy than I think we adults have, especially those of us who grew up without the digital world at our fingertips. Often kids really do think that if they sext somebody, that's private. They don't really understand that it's okay. I got it. So to the girls, here's what I would say. You know, we want to work on empowering young women to you know, be in charge of their bodies, that their worth does not depend on some boy thinking they're hot, that their worth is not about their body, right? Those are messages. But here's another message. I talk to kids a lot about safer sexting, right? We talk about safer sex back in the 80s when HIV. If I can't get a kid to not, you know, some kids are going to send a sext no matter what I do. So here's what I'm going to tell them. Make sure your face is not in that photo. Make sure if you have any identifiable tattoos or scars or body piercings or marks, that you can't see those in the photo. If everybody knows what your bedroom looks like, don't take a photo there. Because what you want, if you're going to sext somebody, is you want to be able, as much as you can, to have plausible deniability, to say that's not me, right? But if it's your face, if it's everybody knows you have a My Little Pony, you know, bedroom, if everybody knows about that tattoo that they see all the time, there's no way you're going to be able to say that's not me. And you know, and that means that when anybody, from your grandma to your college counselor to your boss to your next sweetheart, is online, they may come across this. So the other thing we have to equip kids who sext with are strategies for what are you going to do if somebody who you didn't want to see that photo sees it. So one sort of protective way is to try to make sure the photo is one where you can say, oh, that's not me. And there's really nothing that can make it prove that it's you. But the second thing is, if that happens, how do we deal with that? What do we do? Because we know stories of kids who have unfortunately become so distraught that, you know, they've taken drastic measures, including suicide. And we don't want any kid to be in that position. We don't want any kid to be that panicked and hurt and afraid. So there are multiple approaches we need to take here. There's no one magic solution. But I think we start with confronting this idea that who said it was normal for somebody to be able to request a nude picture and that person just has to comply, or else they're suddenly a loser. Like, that's a place to start. Don't let that just pass by. Don't let them use words like normal without really challenging that. So those are some thoughts I have there. We're very close.
Question to that, which was how would you approach explaining consent to young people in regards to viewing and posting?
So this comes to the whole reputation thing, right? So because very often sexting, my experience is very often sexting actually happens between kids who are in a relationship, like sweethearts are sharing photos back and forth. It's not always some like random boy asking a random girl for a photo. That happens. But in terms of consent, the consent doesn't count. If I say to you, do you consent to send me a nude picture? And you say yes, here's the thing. You've consented to me, but that photo, once it exists in digital form, it's available. And their consent goes out the window. So they're like, even if somebody says yes, even if somebody asks, would you please send me a nude picture? And another person says, yes, I will send you a nude picture. There's consent in that interaction. But, you know, what's the consent after that moment, right? Because I can say to somebody, yes, I'm going to send you a picture, but it's for your eyes only. And somebody can say, oh, yeah, it's only for me. I'm never going to show it to anybody else. And then somebody's buddies say, oh, come on, I know you have it. Or somebody accidentally sees it on their phone and says, ooh, what's that? Send that to me, right? Ideally, that person would say, I have to get consent to do that. Most people are not going to do that. So we have to talk about consent, that when we're talking about the digital world, and especially photos that we take and put in the digital world, we cannot control them. And so we cannot cover every consent possibility in that. And so it's safer not to do that. I long for the days when a nude picture was actually a photograph that I like gave to somebody, because, you know, besides the fact of what you had to do to get that, you know, that picture, that photograph might get around the schoolyard. It's not going to get to China. But as soon as I put an image online, I don't know where it can get. And I think that's a reality we just have to help kids understand. And they're not good at understanding that, you know, and that's a message we need to repeat and repeat and repeat, and help them, you know, if they really want to feel in charge of their lives, once you put something out there online, you're not in charge of it anymore. And that can be difficult and dangerous. Yeah. I want to be conscious of our time. We're a little bit over. I want to thank you all so much for being with us tonight and for sticking with me. Please, you know, you can look me up online. I'm very happy to be a continuing resource for any of you. Please feel free to reach out. And I would be happy to continue conversations with you. Thank you so much for being a part of tonight's presentation. Thank you so much to the Southern New Jersey Perinatal Corporation for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to working with you again. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I just put in our website, so it will be available on the website. You got to give me a little time to put it up there, but it will be on there.
Take your time, anytime. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.